She had his son's lunch packed before he was even awake. His home ran on her schedule, her memory, her hands. And the day he decided she was replaceable, he said it in front of witnesses, like a man proving a point. His 8-year-old son was standing in the doorway. Leo didn't cry. He just went very still. Preston Miller was a man who believed his algorithms explained everything. Who got hired, who got fired, what succeeded, what failed. Numbers didn't lie. People did. So when Joyce Delaney stopped being useful to his system, he removed her. Simple. Clean. Final. What he never thought to ask, in 4 years, not once, was who she was before she walked through his door. Because the men who ran the companies Preston Miller spent his whole life trying to impress, the ones with the real money, the real power, they knew her name. They had all called it in the dark, when everything was burning and no one else could help. And he fired her over lunch. Welcome in. If you're new, subscribe, this is your sign. Drop where you're watching from in the comments. This is exactly the kind of story we tell. Let's get into it. Nobody in that house ever saw Joyce arrive. That was the first thing. She was simply there. Coffee already brewing, the kitchen already smelling like something warm and intentional, Leo's bag already by the door with the permission slip he'd forgotten signed and folded inside the front pocket. She never announced herself. She never needed to. But Leo noticed. Leo always noticed. He was the kind of child who watched adults the way adults never expected children to. Quietly, from the edges of rooms, storing information he didn't yet have words for. And what Leo had decided about Joyce, somewhere around his 7th birthday, was that she was the most capable person in the building. More capable than his father's executive assistant. More capable, he suspected, than his father. He just didn't know why she was here. Because there were things Joyce did that didn't fit. Small things. The kind you'd only catch if you were paying attention. Once a man came to the door, expensive suit, nervous hands, asking for Preston. Preston wasn't home. Joyce told him that. And then, before she closed the door, she said 4 words in a tone Leo had never heard from her before. Calm. Flat. Final. The man left without another word and never came back. Leo asked her about it that evening. Joyce smiled and said she'd simply told him to have a good day. Leo was 8 years old. He knew that wasn't what happened. He started watching her differently after that. Not with suspicion, with something closer to reverence. He began to understand that the woman who packed his lunch and remembered how he liked his eggs was performing a role. And that underneath it, very carefully hidden, was someone else entirely. He just hadn't figured out who yet. Neither had anyone else in that house. And that, it turned out, was exactly the way Joyce needed it. Preston Miller had a system for everything. Morning routine optimized. Calendar. Color-coded by priority. Even his meals were scheduled, not because he was passionate about food, but because inefficiency at any level was a variable he refused to tolerate. His life was a machine. And for 4 years, without him ever once acknowledging it, Joyce had been the part of that machine keeping everything else from grinding to a halt. He found out on day 3. Day 1, he'd assumed things would sort themselves. Day 2, he'd called an agency. By day 3, Leo had missed school, there was no coffee, a contractor had shown up at 7 in the morning for a boiler inspection. Preston had no record of scheduling. And somewhere between the contractor and a missed call from his son's teacher, Preston realized he didn't actually know how his own house ran. He didn't know which plumber Joyce used, or why. He didn't know Leo's teacher's name. He didn't know the code for the security panel, because Joyce had reset it 6 months ago after she noticed a pattern in the neighborhood. And she'd told him, and he hadn't listened. By the end of the first week, 3 things had gone wrong that should have been impossible. A payment to his property management company bounced, not because the money wasn't there, but because the account details had been updated and only Joyce knew the new ones. A lease renewal on a storage unit he'd forgotten he owned lapsed and went to auction. And a certified letter arrived, the 3rd one apparently in a series, from a firm he'd never heard of, regarding a structural inspection on the house that was now 6 weeks overdue. Preston stood in his kitchen on a Friday evening, takeout containers on the counter, Leo asleep upstairs, and stared at that letter. The house he'd paid $4 million for had a compliance problem he didn't know existed. And the only person who had known about it had walked out of his door 8 days ago carrying a single bag. He hadn't even learned her last name until he had to write it on the termination form. It started with a number that shouldn't have moved. Preston's lead engineer flagged it on a Tuesday morning, a single anomaly in the platform's data traffic, the kind of blip that gets dismissed as a server hiccup on a normal day. But this wasn't a normal day, and the engineer had been watching the system closely enough to know that what he was looking at wasn't a hiccup. Something was inside. Something quiet, patient, and deliberate. Something that had been there for a while. By noon, they knew it was a breach. By 2 o'clock, they knew it was bleeding. User data. Proprietary architecture. 14 months of behavioral analytics that Preston had never publicly disclosed existed. The kind of data that, if it surfaced, wouldn't just embarrass him. It would end him. He called his head of cybersecurity into his office and asked one question. How long do we have? The man looked at his screen for a long moment. Then he said, "It depends on who planted it." That word, planted, changed the temperature of the room entirely. This wasn't opportunistic. Someone hadn't stumbled into his system through a weak password or an unpatched vulnerability. This had been architected. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to enter, where to hide, and what to take. Preston's engineer said he had never seen code written quite like it. Layered in a way that felt almost like a signature, if you knew what you were looking for. Preston put 3 firms on it before the week was out. The first said they needed 60 days. The second quoted a number that made his CFO go pale. The third, the most decorated, the most expensive, the one whose founder had testified before Congress, sent back a single line after reviewing the initial report. "We've seen this architecture before. We don't know who built it. But whoever did, they're not available to us." Preston read that line 4 times. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet apartment with no nameplate on the door, a phone screen lit up with a notification, and went dark again, unanswered. It was Leo who broke it open. And he did it the way he did everything, quietly, without drama, in a way that made Preston feel like the last person in the room to understand something everyone else already knew. They were at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, Preston staring at his laptop, the breach documentation open in one tab and a glass of scotch he hadn't touched in the other. Leo was doing homework. Or he'd been doing homework. At some point he'd stopped, and now he was watching his father with that particular stillness Preston had never learned to read. "Dad," Leo said, "are you looking for someone to fix the computer problem?" Preston looked up. "Yes," he said carefully. "Why?" Leo was quiet for a moment. Then, "Joyce could probably do it." Preston set down his glass. He asked his 8-year-old son what he meant by that. And Leo, with the patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time to have this conversation, told him. He told him about the man at the door. About the 4 words and the tone he'd never heard from her before. He told him about the time Joyce had spent 45 minutes on his father's laptop. Not cleaning it, not updating it, but doing something else entirely, something that had made the machine run faster than it ever had and had apparently fixed a problem Preston's IT team had been trying to diagnose for 3 weeks. Joyce had mentioned it to no one. She'd simply done it and gone back to the kitchen. Leo told his father about the notebook. The small black one Joyce kept in the inside pocket of her bag. Not for grocery lists, because Leo had seen it once when it fell open on the counter. It wasn't groceries. It was code. Preston didn't speak for a long time. Then he asked the question Leo had been waiting for. What was her full name? And Leo said, "I think you already wrote it on a form." He found 4 of them. 4 names, 4 firms, for people who came recommended by people he trusted. And the first thing Preston did before he made a single call was pull Joyce's employment form from the filing cabinet in his home office. He looked at her full name for a long time. Then he put it back. The first consultant, a man named Dakarai Osei who'd handled breach recovery for 2 West African banks, told Preston he was booked through August. It was March. The second didn't return his call. The third called back within the hour, asked 3 questions about the breach, and told Preston the attack signature sounded like something that had already moved laterally through his network, that the real damage probably wasn't what he'd found, but what he hadn't. Then she named a figure. Preston had paid for a car with less. He said he'd think about it. He did not think about it. The fourth was a referral from his CFO, someone who had apparently worked for a signals intelligence unit before going private. Preston got as far as a 30-minute call. The man's first question was not about the breach. It was about who had access to Preston's calendar. Everyone, Preston said, without thinking. And then the silence on the line had a texture to it. A quality. The kind that made you review what you'd just said. The call ended cordially. The man said he'd be in touch by Friday. It was now the following Tuesday. Preston sat in his car in the parking garage beneath his office, engine off, phone face down on the passenger seat. 4 experts. One astronomical quote he'd balked at. One man who hadn't called back. One silence he couldn't stop hearing. He picked up the phone. He didn't open his contacts. He opened the house staff folder, the one his PA maintained, the one he almost never touched himself. He scrolled to D. Her name in the folder was Joyce Delaney. No credentials listed, no prior employer. Just a phone number his PA had marked verified without explanation for what that meant. Preston searched the name anyway. He expected nothing. He found a legend. Not a ghost, the opposite. Joyce Delaney appeared in 4 cybersecurity postmortems between 2017 and 2023, each crediting an unnamed architect whose intervention had contained what actuaries had already classified as unrecoverable. A breach report from a Northeast hospital network called her the outside consultant. A redacted SEC filing referenced a Delaney model containment protocol as if it were standard terminology. As if everyone knew what that meant. Preston had never heard it in his life. He searched deeper. A TED Talk invitation she had declined. A Forbes profile killed at the draft stage. He only found it because a journalist had complained about it, obliquely, on a now-archived blog. A patent filed under her name in 2019 for an intrusion detection framework that 3 major firms had since built products around, quietly, without attribution. She had walked away from all of it. The question that stopped him. Why? He found no answer. Just the number in the folder. He called it. 4 rings. He assembled the sentence in his head. My name is Preston Miller. I believe you've worked in my home. I have a situation that requires. He'd chosen the word requires because it sounded less like begging than the alternatives. She picked up on the 5th ring. No greeting. Just open air, and something faint beneath it he couldn't place. Music, maybe, or traffic, or something deliberate. He said her name. She said, I know who you are, Mr. Miller. A beat. I wondered how long it would take you. He had prepared for reluctance. He had prepared for negotiation. He had not prepared for the specific sensation of being the last person again to understand something everyone else already knew. He hadn't even told her why he was calling. She agreed to meet. That was the first surprise. The second was the location. Not his office, not a neutral conference room, not anywhere his assistant could prep or his security team could sweep. A coffee shop on the east side, the kind with mismatched chairs and no reliable Wi-Fi, which he suspected was not accidental. She was already there when he arrived. He recognized her from the cached photograph, the stillness, the slight remove, but the photograph hadn't conveyed the quality of her attention. She looked up when he walked in and didn't look away while he crossed the room, ordered nothing and sat down. She watched him the way she'd watched that camera. Like she was deciding something she'd already decided. He put his hands on the table. He told her everything. He told her about the breach, the consultants, the silence on the line that still bothered him. He told her what the 3rd consultant had said about lateral movement. Damage not in what he'd found, but what he hadn't. He watched Joyce's face while he said it. Nothing moved. Which told him everything. She already knew the signature. She'd seen it before. When he finished, she picked up her cup. Set it down without drinking. Then she said, Your network isn't the primary target, Mr. Miller. It's the relay. The room kept making its noise around him. He asked what that meant. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite pity. Something in between, the look of a woman deciding how much to simplify. It means, she said, someone used your system to get somewhere else. And wherever they went, they left a door open. He asked if she could close it. She said, I already mapped it. 3 weeks ago. I was waiting to see if you'd find it yourself. The coffee shop noise continued. Preston did not move. She had been in his house. She had already seen it. What had she done with what she found? She didn't ask for access. She already had it. That was the thing Preston kept returning to while he watched her work. Seated across from his lead engineer in the glass-walled conference room, laptop open, 3 windows running simultaneously, speaking in a register so calm it made the room quieter just to be in it. She had credentials she shouldn't have had. His engineer, a man named Tobias who had never once deferred to anyone in that room, was taking notes. Within 40 minutes she had traced the relay path to its destination. A logistics firm 2 vendors removed from Preston's supply chain. She showed Tobias the open door. Then she showed him the second one, the one behind it, the one nobody had thought to look for because finding the first felt like enough. Tobias looked at her. Then at his screen. Then back at her. How long has this been here? He asked. The first door, she said, about 4 months. The second one was opened 11 days ago. Someone came back to check if you'd noticed. The room went very quiet. Preston stood at the glass wall and watched her close both. It took less time than the conversation about them. She worked the way Leo had described her working on his laptop, without ceremony, without explanation, like the solution was never the hard part. Like the hard part was always something else. When it was done, Tobias shook her hand with both of his. She accepted it without performance and began closing her windows. Preston followed her into the hallway. He said, "Thank you." Then, because it felt insufficient and also true, "I didn't know." She stopped walking. "I know you didn't," she said. Not unkindly. But without absolution either. He asked if she'd come back. To the work, he meant to the work. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. "That depends," she said, "on what you're actually asking." He wasn't entirely sure himself. She sent her invoice by email. No letterhead, no firm name, just a number, a routing account, and a single line at the bottom that read, "Recommend quarterly architecture reviews. You'll know why soon enough." Preston read that line 4 times. He paid within the hour. Then he sat with the "you'll know why" for the rest of the afternoon. Because it wasn't a threat and it wasn't reassurance and it occupied the uncomfortable space between both. She didn't return to the house. He hadn't expected her to, but he noticed the not returning in a way he wouldn't have a month ago. Leo noticed too. He asked once, carefully, in the way he asked things he already suspected the answer to. Preston told him Joyce had finished the job she came to do. Leo nodded and went back to his homework and didn't ask again, which was somehow worse than if he had. The crisis resolved publicly the way these things did, quietly, in the language of non-disclosure and managed narrative. His board was told a containment specialist had been engaged. The logistics firm downstream received a certified letter from his legal team. Tobias updated the internal protocol documentation and named the new framework without attribution, because there was no name he'd been given permission to use. Preston's company stabilized. His calendar filled back up. 3 journalists who'd been circling the story lost interest when nothing collapsed. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, Preston knew something he hadn't known before. Not about cybersecurity, not about breach vectors or relay networks or open doors. Something simpler and harder to file away. He had been the least aware person in his own life. His 8-year-old had seen it. His housekeeper had mapped it. His lead engineer had deferred to someone Preston had signed a household employment form for without reading her full name. He picked up his phone. He opened a new message. He typed, "I think I owe you a different conversation." He stared at it for a long time. He didn't send it. Not yet. Preston typed the message. He didn't send it. Not yet. Some of you aren't ready to send yours either. Subscribe and wait for what happens next.